Let's quickly talk about Form 706 NA. So here's the approach I want you to really pay attention to. So I want you to look right now to look on the screen here. So 706 NA is kind of similar to 706. The only difference is that for 706 NA, we are speaking about a non-resident alien. Okay, in other words, non-resident and also not a citizen of the United States. So if you are a non-resident alien, let's say if you have a green card, for instance, you might actually qualify for 706 and not 706 NA. So 706 NA is for non-resident, not a citizen of the United States. Okay, so you can see part one here. You have a descendant, executor, and an attorney. So part one is pretty straightforward in terms of providing some kind of background information, if you will. So from line 1A all the way through line 11, just follow the instructions, and it's a pretty straightforward. What you have to put it where, okay, place of birth, date of birth, and so on and so forth. And please don't forget to actually include the descendant's tax identification number, because if the descendant doesn't have a social security number, because he or she was not a U.S. citizen, you must have some kind of identification, and this can be actually a TIN, a TIN. And I want to show you right now on the screen here, part two. So part two, we are speaking about the tax computation. So the computation is pretty straightforward. So we're speaking about from line 1 all the way through line 16. So you start with the taxable estates from Schedule B, line 9, and you go all the way through to the balance due in terms of taxes. And one of those things I want to make sure that you pay attention to is that there are cases where you have to back up whatever claims you have here on this form. So make sure that you have the proper documentation so that if the IRS were to ask you additional questions, you are able to provide the appropriate answers. And don't forget to sign and date the form. So you, of course, I'm speaking to you, the executor or the executor or the administrator of the estate of the non-resident descendants. And if there is a paid preparer, so put that information there as well. And the IRS can contact the paid preparer, not a problem. And part three, as you can see on the screen here, part three has to deal with general information. So here you have a series of questions and answers. And the fourth screenshot is there. That's Schedule A, gross estate in the United States. Remember, we are speaking about a descendant who was not a U.S. citizen, but still had assets in the United States. By the way, boss, welcome back to the show. It's really a pleasure to have you here. Make yourself comfortable. You are going to enjoy today's conversation. Let me give you an overview about this form here. So when we talk about Form 706 NA, it's important to really understand that this form allows you to calculate and report the estate tax owed to the IRS when a non-resident alien descendant passes away and leaves behind assets located in the United States. So if the assets are located in the on U.S. territory, then you have to file this form 706 NA. So this form is required to be filed if the total value of the descendant's U.S. assets exceeds the applicable thresholds set by the IRS. So this is kind of important. So basically on the form, you have a comprehensive overview of, as you saw, of the descendants' estates, including details about the assets owed, their values, deductions, exemptions, and any other applicable tax credits. And it also requires information about the descendants' beneficiaries and the distribution of the estate. The IRS is really concerned about that. I mean, not concerned, but they're really interested about that. And then, so when we talk about this form specifically, there are several benefits when it comes to filing Form 706 NA. That's why you want to file this form in as soon as possible. You have compliance with the U.S. tax laws, because the last thing you want is the IRS actually enforcing the Internal Revenue Code and coming after your assets, because it doesn't matter if the descendants was or was not a U.S. citizen. As long as there is a connection to U.S. soil, then you need to really respond to the IRS. And you also have to think about utilization of tax exemptions and deductions, planning for future generations, especially if the descendants had some connection with the U.S. and still has connection with the U.S. You also want to think about coordination with estate planning strategies, because filing Form 706 NA allows non-resident aliens to coordinate their estate planning strategies with U.S. tax laws. So this is kind of cool. And you also have access to potential tax credits and refunds if you really file on time and you file properly. So long story short, one thing I want to say here is that it's one of those things where you want to always file, as long as the descendants had a connection, had assets that were connected to the United States. You want to file, and you want to file promptly. By the way, boss, I want to quickly remind you of today's topic. We are having a conversation about the Form 706NA. I want to talk to you about eligibility here. So who is eligible to file this Form 706NA? Basically, we are speaking about, so you have several criteria, right? Obviously, the descendants cannot file this form. It has to be the executor or the administrator. But for this to happen, you got to have three things. So three important criteria. First of all, non-resident, non-citizenship status. So in other words, non-resident alien status. So the descendant must be a non-resident alien at the time of his or her death, right? If not, we are actually reverting back to a Form 706 only. So a non-resident alien is someone who is not a U.S. citizen and does not meet the criteria to be classified as a U.S. resident for tax purposes. And the descendants must have ownership of U.S. situs property. So this is what we call in other words, the property must be located in the United States. So U.S. situs property. So the descendants must have owned property located in the United States that is subject to U.S. estate tax. So U.S. situs property typically includes real estate, tangible property, and certain financial assets located within the United States. And you also have to abide by something called the threshold requirements. So the total value of the descendants' U.S. situs assets must exceed the applicable exemption threshold for the year of the descendant's death. So the exemption threshold is actually subject to a change and should be checked with the Internal Revenue Service for the specific year. So if you listen to me right now, this year it's around $12 to $13 million. But again, this is something that changes all the time. So make sure that you double check. Okay. Now, one thing I want to say here is that if a non-resident alien meets those criteria, he or she may be required to file Form 706NA to report and pay estate taxes on his or her U.S. situs assets. Now, not the descendant himself or herself, right? But it will be his or her, the administrator or the estate advisor or whatever. So it's one of those things where these things happen after death. I mean, it happens after death, but the IRS just wants to make sure that the proper accounting of the descendants' assets is made at the time of filing this Form 706NA. I want to talk to you about the steps you need to really pay attention to when you are filing Form 706NA. So basically, you want to obtain the necessary forms and instructions. Basically, 706NA can be pretty convoluted depending on the size of the descendants' U.S. situs estate, if you will, and you want to gather the required information. So we are talking about you want to have personal details of the deceased individual, information about the estate, and the fair market value of the assets. Again, we are speaking about U.S. situs assets. Anything else that is outside the United States doesn't really matter here. And so you want to really also take care of the general information. So we're talking about the descendants' personal information, including their name, social or individual taxpayer identification number, the date of death, the place of death. And you want to provide the executor's information as well, okay? And you want to complete part 2. I think I showed you a little earlier. So we are speaking about elections by the executor. So in this section, the executor can make certain elections, such as the use of alternate valuation dates or the allocation of the GST exemption. So you want to just follow the instructions and mark the appropriate boxes based on the choices made. And you want to fill out part 3. So part 3 actually has to deal with computation of tax. So you are basically able to calculate the estate tax owed. So here you want to provide the fair market value of the assets and calculate the gross estates. You want to subtract allowable deductions and arrive at the taxable estate and apply the tax rates to determine the tentative tax, if you will. And step 6, you really have to actually complete part 4. Now, part 4 has to deal with credit for tax on prior transfers. If those are applicable to the descendants, then you may qualify. So if there have been any previous taxable transfers, they may impact the estate tax calculation. So again, here you want to follow the instructions to determine the credit for tax on prior transfers, if applicable. By the way, boss, I want to quickly remind you of today's topic. We are having a conversation about Form 706NA. One thing I want to talk about here is that I want to talk to you about the tax computation and payment. So basically, the information that you had in Part 3 and Part 4, you are able to compute the final estate tax amount owed, right? So if any gift or GST tax is payable, you want to include it as well. You want to provide details of any prior payments made. You want to calculate the net tax due and indicate the method of payment. And again, it's all about being as precise as possible and granular as possible. And you also want to complete Part 6. So Part 6 has to deal with the consent to extend the time to assess tax. So if you need additional time to gather information, or if, let's say, if the estate is subject to litigation, because this can happen also, I mean, you never know, you may need to request an extension of time to assess the tax. So again, here you want to follow the instructions in this section if applicable. So this is pretty much it. Okay, so once you have you've done all this, you are pretty set to go. And so you want to sign and date the form. Make sure you sign and date the form. And again, we're talking about having the form signed and dated by the executor or authorized representative. And if a paid preparer assisted in completing the form, they should also sign and include their information, including their EIN and PTIN, so professional tax identification number, just in case the IRS wants to reach out to the professional preparer. And you also, please don't forget to attach the required information, because it's one of those things where just telling the IRS, this is the info, wouldn't really be sufficient. You have to provide supporting documentation. So we're speaking about the appraisal of the property, copies of wills and trusts, and any other relevant paperwork. So once you're done, just that's pretty much it. Submit the form, make a copy for your own records, make a copy of the completed Form 706NA, and as well as all supporting documents for your records. Mail the original to the address provided in the instructions. And so it's always important to have proof of delivery. So it's better to have the form delivered via certified mail, so you can have a proof of delivery ASAP. Let me give you a few special considerations here that you have to be aware of when filing Form 706NA. Basically, we are speaking about the U.S. assets, right? I think I've sort of established that before. Non-resident alien status. So basically, when we talk about non-resident alien status, basically this Form 706NA is specifically for non-resident aliens, which means individuals who are not U.S. citizens and do not reside in the United States at the time of their death. Only estates of non-resident aliens should use this form. U.S. assets, I think I said this before, U.S. situs property. And you are able to determine the gross estate. So the gross estate includes all assets subject to U.S. estate tax, such as real estate, tangible personal property, and certain intangible assets located in the United States. And so you got to really carefully determine the fair market value of those assets as of the date of the descendant's death. And also you got to think about applicable exclusion amounts. So basically Form 706NA allows for an applicable exclusion amount that may reduce or eliminate the estate tax liability. So the exclusion amount is subject to a change each year. So it's really essential to consult the most recent IRS instructions, or a tax professional for that matter, to determine the correct amount for the year of the descendant's death. Now, when we talk about this form also, generally you got to think about filing deadline and extensions. So you can file Form 706NA within 9 months from the date of the descendant's death. However, you may request an automatic 6-month extension by filing Form 4768. So please just make sure that you adhere to the filing deadlines to avoid penalties and interest. And also, basically, there's something called qualified domestic trust, so Q dot. So if the descendant's surviving spouse is a non-US citizen, you may consider establishing a qualified domestic trust, so that, basically when we talk about a Q dot, this is a tool that allows the deferral of estate tax on assets passing to the surviving spouse. And specific rules and requirements apply, so you always want to consult with the tax advisor to determine eligibility and establish a Q dot if needed. Okay, and so long story short, it's all about compliance. And also, in terms of reporting and payments, Form 706 NA requires a detailed listing of all the assets, deductions, and credits claimed. So ensure accurate reporting of all required information. So the estate tax owed, if any, must be paid in US dollars. So this is pretty straightforward. Now let's talk about filing deadlines and extensions on this form here. So the thing is that, as I think I just said to you, it's 9 months after the date of the descendant's death. For example, if the descendants passed away on January 1st, the initial filing deadline will be September 30th for the same year. Okay, so now you do have extension of time to file. So if you need additional time, just file Form 4768, and then you have 6 more months. Okay, and but if you don't file within the appropriate time, you might expose yourself to late filing and penalties. And there are also some common mistakes that you need to avoid here: incorrect or incomplete information. So when you file Form 706 NA, make sure that you have the proper data. And also, failure to attach supporting documentation can be pretty crippling when it comes to this Form 706 NA. So it's one of those things where you have to be pretty straightforward when it comes to that. You have incorrect valuation of assets. So you want to value assets properly to have a clear idea of what kind of communication you are giving to the IRS. And so errors in asset valuation can lead to underpayment or overpayment of estate tax. And also, when we talk about deductions and credits, there could be an overlooking of the applicable deductions and credits. So be aware of the available deductions and credits specific to Form 706 NA. So common deductions include funeral expenses, debts, administration expenses, and charitable contributions. So failing to actually claim eligible deductions and credits can result in unnecessary tax liability, and you do not want to have that. Okay, so be very careful on that front. Also, think about incorrect calculation of tax liability. So again, you also have the potential mistake of a late or missing filing. So again, you got to really think about 9 months. It's now there is a possible 6-month extension, but you want to file on time, and also get the help of a CPA, a tax attorney, or an EA, somebody who really has a clear idea about what he or she is doing, and get the help to kind of help you out if needed. Thank you so much for your attention. I really appreciate it. Let's quickly recap to this conversation. So I was just talking to you about Form 706 NA. So I gave you the approach, the overview, the steps, and now I'm doing the recap. Thank you so much. God bless you. I'll see you next time. Until then, remember, stay marvelous.